The scent of rotting vegetables and horse manure clung to her worn calico dress as Josephine Lambert pressed herself against the side wall of the mercantile, hoping no one would notice her waiting for scraps. Her stomach had given up growling 3 days ago, settling instead into a hollow ache that made her dizzy when she stood too quickly. She was 22 years old and had been beautiful once, before hunger carved shadows beneath her cheekbones and exhaustion dimmed the emerald green of her eyes. Fort Davis, Texas, in 1883 was not kind to women without means. The high desert town sat nestled in the Davis Mountains, a place where cattlemen and soldiers from the nearby fort brought business and rough company in equal measure. Josephine had arrived 6 months earlier on a stagecoach with her aunt, only to watch the older woman succumb to pneumonia within a fortnight. The meager savings they had brought west disappeared into funeral costs and a week's rent at a boarding house. After that, Josephine found herself on the street with nothing but the dress on her back and a growing understanding that survival required sacrifices she was not yet desperate enough to make. She woke each morning not knowing if she would eat. Some days brought luck in the form of day labor, washing linens for the hotel or scrubbing floors at the saloon before the drinking started. Other days brought nothing but the long stretch of hours and the gnawing certainty that her body was consuming itself to stay alive. Today had been one of the empty days. She had asked at every establishment on the main street, received nothing but dismissals or looks that made her skin crawl. The baker's wife had taken pity on her last week, but when Josephine returned, the woman's husband had turned her away with sharp words about encouraging vagrancy. Now she waited behind the mercantile, where Mr. Chen sometimes left his spoiled produce in a crate rather than in the hog pen. It was not much, but soft apples and wilted greens could keep a person breathing. The back door swung open, and Josephine tensed, ready to flee if it was someone who would chase her off. But it was only Mr. Chen himself, carrying a wooden box. He saw her, and his weathered face showed neither surprise nor judgment. He set the box down, nodded once, and returned inside without a word. Josephine waited until the door closed before rushing forward. The crate held 3 wrinkled potatoes, a handful of bruised peaches, and half a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth that must have gone stale. Her hands shook as she reached for the bread. "That is not a meal fit for a dog, much less a lady." The voice came from behind her, deep and startling. Josephine spun around, clutching the bread to her chest like a shield. A man stood at the corner of the building, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar beneath a dusty brown hat. He wore the clothes of a working cattleman, denim trousers and a sun-faded shirt, boots that had seen hard miles. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark brown and direct, holding something that might have been concern. "It is my meal," Josephine said, lifting her chin despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "And I will thank you to mind your own affairs." "Fair enough," the man said, but he did not move away. "Though I was about to head to the hotel dining room for supper and could use some company." "Seems a shame to eat alone when there is a perfectly good second chair going to waste." Josephine stared at him, trying to determine his angle. Men did not offer charity without expecting something in return. She had learned that much in her months of desperation. "I have no money to pay for a meal, and I will not trade other considerations for one either." Something flickered across his face that might have been offense, or perhaps respect. "I am not asking for either. I am asking if you would like to have supper, a real one with a plate and a table, nothing more complicated than that." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended, edged with all the suspicion that hunger and hardship had honed into a survival skill. He pushed his hat back slightly, and she saw that his face was sunburned across the bridge of his nose, the mark of a man who spent his days outside. "Because I have been hungry before," he said simply, "and because no one should have to eat spoiled food in an alley when there is plenty to go around." Josephine wanted to refuse on principle. She had her pride, even if it was about all she had left. But the smell of the bread in her hands reminded her of how inadequate it would be, how her stomach would still ache even after she choked down every dry crumb. And there was something in this stranger's manner that did not set off the warning bells she had learned to heed. He stood at a respectful distance, his posture open rather than threatening, and he looked at her face rather than letting his gaze wander elsewhere. "One meal," she said carefully, "and I am sitting where I can see the door." "Agreed." He gestured toward the street. "After you, Miss Lambert, Josephine Lambert." "Harrison Northwood," he said, and something in the way he said his own name suggested he was not used to introducing himself formally. "Most people just call me Harrison." They walked around to the front of the building and down the dusty street toward the hotel. Josephine was acutely aware of how she must look. Her dress stained and worn thin at the elbows, her hair pulled back in a braid that had not seen a proper washing in too long. Other women passed in their afternoon dresses with clean collars and matching hats, and she felt the weight of their glances like physical things. Harrison seemed oblivious to it all, his strides steady and unhurried. The hotel dining room was nearly empty at this hour, the space between the lunch and dinner crowds. A few men sat scattered at tables, talking in low voices over coffee. The proprietor looked up when they entered, his expression shifting from neutral to disapproving when he saw Josephine. Harrison either did not notice or did not care. He led her to a table by the window and pulled out her chair himself before taking his own seat. "2 plates of whatever you have hot," Harrison said when the proprietor approached, "and coffee, if it is fresh." "We got beef stew and biscuits," the man said, still eyeing Josephine with suspicion. "That will do fine." When the proprietor left, Josephine folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. The last proper meal she had eaten was nearly a week ago, a thin soup at the church that had left her still hungry. The promise of beef stew seemed almost too good to be real. She half expected Harrison to reveal his true intentions now that they were seated, to make clear what he wanted from her in exchange for this kindness. But he simply removed his hat and set it on the empty chair beside him, running a hand through his hair. "How long have you been in Fort Davis?" he asked, his tone conversational. 6 months, give or take." Josephine saw no reason to lie. Her circumstances were obvious enough. "I came with my aunt. She died shortly after we arrived." "I am sorry," Harrison said, and the words carried genuine sympathy. "You have no other family?" "None that would claim me." It was the truth, stark and simple. Her mother had died when Josephine was young, her father had remarried quickly, and his new wife had made it clear that a grown stepdaughter was an unwelcome burden. When Aunt Margaret had written to say she was heading west to live with a cousin in Texas, Josephine had begged to come along. The cousin had turned out to be long dead, a miscommunication in letters that had proved fatal to their plans. The proprietor returned with 2 thick mugs of coffee, setting them down with more force than necessary. Josephine wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. She had not had real coffee in months. The chicory and burnt grounds that sometimes came her way barely counted. "What about you?" she asked, feeling obligated to show some interest in return. "Are you from Fort Davis?" "Originally from Tennessee," Harrison said. "Came out here after the war. I work cattle mostly. Do some horse breaking when the opportunity arises." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "I have a small ranch about 8 miles north of town. Nothing fancy, but it turns enough profit to keep me fed and the bank satisfied." "That sounds like a fine life," Josephine said, and could not quite keep the wistfulness from her voice. "It can be lonely," Harrison admitted. "But it is honest work, and I am my own master. That counts for something." The food arrived then, and Josephine had to exercise every ounce of self-control to keep from falling on it like a starving animal. The stew was rich with chunks of beef and vegetables, the biscuits golden and steaming. She picked up her spoon with as much dignity as she could muster and took a small bite, closing her eyes as the flavors hit her tongue. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. Harrison ate his own meal without comment, but she caught him watching her once or twice with an expression she could not quite read. She tried to pace herself, to eat like a lady rather than a desperate creature, but the food seemed to vanish from her plate faster than she intended. When the bowl was empty and she had sopped up the last of the gravy with her second biscuit, she sat back and felt the foreign sensation of fullness settling into her stomach. "Thank you," she said quietly, meeting Harrison's eyes across the table. "That was very kind." "It was just supper," he said, but there was something pleased in his expression. He finished his own coffee and set the cup down with a considering look. "Miss Lambert, I am going to make you a proposition, and I want you to hear me out before you decide I am a scoundrel." Josephine tensed, her brief contentment evaporating. "Go on." "I need help at the ranch," Harrison said, his words careful and deliberate. "Someone to manage the house, do the cooking and the washing. Maybe tend a garden if they were inclined. I spend most of my days out with the cattle or mending fences, and I am tired of coming home to a cold house and my own poor excuse for food." He leaned forward slightly. "I am offering you a job, Miss Lambert. Room and board, plus wages. Nothing improper. You would have your own quarters and your own door that locks from the inside. I am simply a man who needs help, and you are a woman who needs work." Josephine stared at him, trying to find the trap in his words. "You are offering me employment?" Just like that, after meeting me in an alley behind the mercantile? "I am offering you a chance," Harrison corrected. "What you were doing back there, that took courage. You were not begging or stealing. You were making do with what was available. That tells me you have character." He sat back again. "Look, I understand if you think this is too sudden or too strange. You can think on it if you like, but the offer is genuine, and it stands as long as you need it to." "Why me?" Josephine asked. "You could place an advertisement, find someone with references and experience." "I could," Harrison agreed, "but I have placed advertisements before, and the women who respond are usually looking for a husband rather than a job. I am not interested in that kind of complication. You, on the other hand, strike me as someone who wants independence more than romance." He raised an eyebrow. "Am I wrong?" He was not wrong, not entirely. Josephine had no illusions about love or marriage. She had seen too many women trapped in miserable unions, bound to men who viewed them as property. What she wanted was simple survival, the security of knowing where her next meal would come from and where she would sleep at night. If she could earn that through honest labor, so much the better. "What would the wages be?" she asked, trying to be practical. $20 a month plus room and board," Harrison said without hesitation. "That is fair for the work, maybe even generous. But I need someone reliable, someone who will stay put and not run off after a few weeks." $20 a month. It was more than Josephine had seen in half a year. With room and board included, it would be pure savings, money she could put away against future catastrophe. The thought of having her own room, her own space, seemed almost too wonderful to contemplate. "When would you want me to start?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you are willing. I can bring a wagon into town at first light, help you gather whatever belongings you have." He paused. "Though I confess I am hoping you will say yes tonight so I know to be here in the morning." Josephine looked down at her empty bowl, at the table that still held crumbs from the best meal she had eaten in memory. She thought about the alley behind the mercantile, about Mr. Chin's charity crate, and the boarding house steps where she sometimes slept when the night watchman was not paying attention. She thought about waking each morning with hunger already gnawing at her, about the constant uncertainty and fear. "Yes," she said, looking up to meet Harrison's eyes, "I will take the job." His face broke into a genuine smile, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his features from severe to almost handsome. "That is good news, Miss Lambert." "I am pleased to hear it." "You may call me Josephine," she said, feeling that formality was a bit absurd given the circumstances. "Josephine," he repeated, trying it out. "Then you should call me Harrison. We are going to be working together after all." May as well be on friendly terms. They settled the details over another cup of coffee. Harrison told her about the ranch, about the small house with its 2 bedrooms, and the creek that ran nearby. He told her what supplies he already had and what she might need to make the place more livable. Josephine listened and asked questions, trying to form a picture in her mind of what her new life would look like. It all seemed too good to be true, and part of her waited for the other shoe to drop. But Harrison remained straightforward and businesslike, his manner suggesting this was simply a practical arrangement between two people who could benefit each other. When they finally left the hotel, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Harrison walked Josephine to the boarding house, where she occasionally convinced the owner to let her sleep on the back porch in exchange for sweeping the floors. "I will be here at dawn," Harrison said, settling his hat back on his head. "Wait out front so you do not have to pay for a night you will not be using." "I will be ready," Josephine promised. She watched him walk away toward the livery stable, his figure silhouetted against the dying light. Then she went around to the back of the boarding house and curled up in the corner of the porch where the wind would not hit her directly. She still had the bread and peaches from Mr. Chen's crate, though she no longer needed them with her stomach full of beef stew. She wrapped them carefully in her shawl anyway, thinking she might offer them to Harrison as a small contribution to the household. It was not much, but it was something. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months, aided by a full belly and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring change. Whether that change would prove to be salvation or simply a different kind of struggle remained to be seen, but at least it was movement forward rather than the slow starvation of standing still. The sky was just beginning to lighten when Josephine woke, stiff from sleeping on boards, but more rested than she had been in weeks. She used the pump in the yard to wash her face and hands, braided her hair as neatly as she could manage, and went to wait on the street. True to his word, Harrison appeared just as the sun broke over the eastern hills, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 horses. He had changed his shirt, but otherwise looked much the same as he had the night before. "Morning!" he called, pulling the wagon to a stop. "You have belongings to collect?" "Nothing worth mentioning," Josephine said, which was the truth. Everything she owned was currently on her person or bundled in the shawl she carried. Harrison nodded as though this was expected. "We can stop by the mercantile then, pick up a few things you might need. I should have thought of it yesterday." "That is not necessary," Josephine started to say, but Harrison was already turning the wagon. "Consider it part of the arrangement," he said. "You cannot be expected to work without proper supplies." The mercantile was just opening when they arrived. Mr. Chen was sweeping the front steps and looked up in surprise when he saw Josephine arriving in a wagon with Harrison Northwood. His expression shifted to something like approval, and he nodded to them both as they entered. Inside, Harrison proved to be a decisive shopper. He selected a bolt of sturdy cotton fabric, needles and thread, a bar of good soap, a hairbrush, and several other items that Josephine would never have purchased for herself. When she protested that it was too much, he simply said, "A worker needs tools," and continued adding to the pile. By the time they left, the back of the wagon held packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, along with a crate of foodstuffs that Harrison said were running low at the ranch. The ride north took them out of town and into the rolling country beyond, where the grassland gave way to scattered juniper and the mountains rose in the distance. The morning air was cool and clean, and Josephine found herself relaxing despite her lingering uncertainty. Harrison drove in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or explaining something about the terrain. He showed her where his property line began, marked by a fence that ran along the road. "Not much to look at yet," he said, as they turned onto a narrower track. "But it has good water, and the grass comes in thick after the rains. The cattle do well enough." The house appeared around a bend, a simple wooden structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney. It was smaller than Josephine had imagined, but solidly built, with glass windows and a good roof. A barn stood nearby, along with several outbuildings and a corral where a few horses watched their approach with mild interest. Everything had the look of a place that was maintained but not fussed over, functional rather than decorative. Harrison helped her down from the wagon and began unloading the supplies. Your room is the one on the right, he said, gesturing toward the house. I am on the left. There is a main room in between, with the kitchen and a table. Not fancy, but it serves. Josephine picked up one of the packages and followed him inside. The main room was dim and cool, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a cook stove against another. A table with two chairs sat near a window, and shelves held a sparse collection of dishes and supplies. Everything was clean but bare, the home of a man who lived there but did not truly inhabit it. The room Harrison indicated as hers was small but private, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. The door had a sturdy lock on the inside, just as he had promised. Josephine set her bundle down on the bed and stood for a moment, taking it in. It was the first room she had been able to call her own since leaving her father's house, the first space that was hers alone. Will it do? Harrison asked from the doorway, not entering. It will do very well, Josephine said, and meant it. They spent the rest of the morning settling her in and discussing the routine of the household. Harrison showed her the spring house where milk and butter were kept cool, the chicken coop where 6 hens scratched and muttered, the garden plot that had gone to weeds in his neglect. He explained that he usually left before dawn to check the cattle and did not return until dusk, sometimes later if there was trouble. What he needed, he said, was to come home to a hot meal and a house that did not feel quite so empty. I can manage that, Josephine said with more confidence than she felt. She had helped her aunt with cooking and household tasks, but she was hardly an expert. Still, she was willing to learn, and determination had carried her through worse challenges than figuring out a cook stove. Harrison saddled a horse after lunch and prepared to ride out. There is a rifle above the door, he said, as he adjusted his stirrups. Do you know how to use one? Well enough, Josephine said. Her father had taught her the basics, though it had been years since she had fired a gun. Good. I do not expect trouble, but we are far enough from town that help would not come quickly. Better to be prepared. He swung into the saddle and looked down at her. I will be back before dark. Make yourself comfortable, and do not worry about having supper ready tonight. I know you need time to settle in. I will manage, Josephine said, lifting her hand to shade her eyes against the sun. It is what you are paying me for, after all. He smiled at that and turned his horse toward the open range. Josephine watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared beyond a rise. Then she turned back to the house and rolled up her sleeves. She had work to do. The afternoon passed in a flurry of activity as Josephine took stock of her new domain. She found the pantry better stocked than she had expected, with sacks of flour and cornmeal, jars of preserved vegetables, and slabs of salted meat. The cook stove took some figuring out, but she managed to get a fire going and set a pot of beans to soak for the next day. She swept the floors, beat the dust from the curtains, and washed the dishes that had accumulated in Harrison's bachelor existence. By the time the sun began its descent, the house had taken on a more lived-in feeling, and Josephine had a pot of coffee brewing and cornbread baking in the oven. Harrison returned just as twilight was settling over the land, leading his horse toward the barn. Josephine watched from the kitchen window as he unsaddled the animal and brushed it down with the careful attention of a man who valued his livestock. When he finally came to the house, he paused on the porch to knock the dust from his boots before entering. Something smells good, he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Cornbread and coffee, Josephine said, feeling oddly pleased by his approval. I did not have time for much else today, but I set beans to soak for tomorrow. Cornbread and coffee sound perfect, Harrison said. He poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed his face and hands, scrubbing away the day's grime. When he sat at the table, Josephine brought him a plate with 2 thick slices of cornbread and a cup of steaming coffee. She took her own seat across from him, suddenly uncertain of the etiquette of the situation. Was she meant to eat with him or take her meals separately. He had not specified. Harrison solved the dilemma by pushing the butter dish toward her. Please help yourself. I am not much for ceremony, and I would appreciate the company. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the quiet broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. It was comfortable rather than awkward, the silence of two people who were still learning each other's rhythms. How did you find the house? Harrison asked eventually, cradling his coffee cup in both hands. Well appointed, Josephine said diplomatically. Though I took the liberty of doing some cleaning, I hope you do not mind. Mind? I am grateful. The place has needed a woman's touch for longer than I care to admit. He paused, then added, My mother always said a house was not a home unless someone cared for it properly. I am afraid I have let that lesson slide. Your mother is not living? Josephine asked gently. She passed during the war. Yellow fever. Harrison's expression grew distant. My father followed not long after. I think he died of grief more than anything else. I am sorry, Josephine said, recognizing the echo of her own losses in his words. It is hard to be alone in the world. Yes, Harrison agreed, his eyes meeting hers with understanding. It is. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was both foreign and comforting to Josephine. She woke with the sun and started the fire, set coffee to brewing and breakfast to cooking. Harrison ate quickly and headed out to his work, leaving Josephine to the tasks of the household. She threw herself into the labor with determination, scrubbing and mending and organizing until the house began to reflect her efforts. She tackled the garden, pulling weeds and turning soil, planting seeds from the packets Harrison brought from town. She learned the quirks of the cook stove and the rhythms of the chickens, discovered which hens were reliable layers and which were simply eating feed without contributing. In the evenings, Harrison returned, and they shared a meal, their conversations gradually growing longer and more personal. He told her about his cattle, about the challenges of ranching in this harsh country. She told him carefully edited stories of her life before Fort Davis, skipping over the darkest parts but sharing enough that he understood where she had come from. There was an ease developing between them, a mutual respect that surprised Josephine with its simplicity. 3 weeks into her employment, Harrison returned from town with an unexpected passenger. The woman who climbed down from the wagon was older, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and a practical manner. Harrison introduced her as Mrs. Sarah Fletcher, the widow of a rancher who lived 10 miles to the east. Sarah heard I had hired a housekeeper and wanted to come by to make sure you were being treated properly, Harrison explained, his tone suggesting this was both expected and slightly embarrassing. She seems to think I need supervision. I think you need someone to keep you honest, Mrs. Fletcher corrected, though her smile was warm. She turned to Josephine and looked her over with sharp eyes. And you must be Miss Lambert. Harrison spoke very highly of you when I saw him in town. It is nice to meet you, Josephine said, uncertain what else to say. Mrs. Fletcher invited herself in for coffee, and Harrison excused himself to tend to the horses, leaving the two women alone. Josephine busied herself with the pot and cups, aware of being evaluated. How are you settling in? Mrs. Fletcher asked, her tone direct. Very well, Josephine said carefully. Mr. Northwood has been nothing but respectful and fair. I am glad to hear it. Harrison is a good man, but I wanted to see for myself that you were being treated right. There are too many men in this country who take advantage of women in difficult circumstances. Mrs. Fletcher accepted the coffee cup with a nod of thanks. I lost my husband 2 years ago, and I know what it is to have to fend for yourself. If you ever need anything at all, my ranch is not far. You are welcome there. The offer brought unexpected tears to Josephine's eyes. She had been alone for so long that the simple kindness of another woman's concern felt overwhelming. Thank you, she managed. That means more than you know. Good. Mrs. Fletcher patted her hand. Now, tell me what you have been planting in that garden. I have some seedlings at home that might do well here if you are interested. They talked for nearly an hour, and by the time Mrs. Fletcher left, Josephine felt she had gained not just a potential friend, but a lifeline to the wider community. Harrison seemed pleased when she told him about the conversation, nodding his approval. "Sarah is good people," he said. "Her husband and I used to help each other during branding season. I am glad she came by." As spring deepened into summer, Josephine found herself settling into the life of the ranch with increasing comfort. The garden flourished under her care, producing vegetables that she preserved in jars for the winter. The chickens thrived, and she convinced Harrison to let her try her hand at raising a few ducks as well. The house took on a warmth it had previously lacked, with curtains she sewed from the fabric Harrison had bought and meals that went beyond simple sustenance to something approaching pleasure. But more than the physical improvements to the ranch, Josephine noticed changes in herself. The constant fear that had haunted her in Fort Davis began to fade, replaced by a growing confidence. She put on weight, her face filling out and her eyes regaining their brightness. She slept soundly at night, no longer starting awake at every sound, and she found herself looking forward to the evenings when Harrison returned, to their conversations over dinner and the comfortable silences that followed. Harrison changed too, in subtle ways. He smiled more readily, laughed at small things that would have passed without comment before. He began coming home earlier when he could, and sometimes he helped her with tasks around the house, splitting firewood or repairing a loose board on the porch. Once, she caught him humming while he washed up for dinner, and the sound made her heart do something strange and unexpected. She tried not to think too much about what that meant. Their arrangement was a business one, practical and clearly defined. Harrison had given her security and steady work, and she provided him with a well-run household. It was enough, she told herself. It had to be enough. But then came the evening when everything shifted. A summer storm had blown in during the afternoon, bringing rain that hammered the roof and wind that rattled the windows. Harrison had made it back just ahead of the worst of it, soaked through and shivering. Josephine had insisted he change into dry clothes while she heated water for coffee and pulled a blanket from the chest. When he emerged from his room in fresh shirt and trousers, she thrust the blanket at him and pushed him toward the chair nearest the fire. "You will catch your death," she scolded, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly. "Honestly, you should have waited out the storm in the barn." "I wanted to make sure you were all right," Harrison said, accepting the cup gratefully. "Some of these storms can be fierce." "I am perfectly capable of weathering a storm," Josephine said, but the complaint lacked heat. She was too focused on the way his hair was plastered to his forehead, the way he wrapped both hands around the cup as though trying to draw all its warmth into himself. "I know you are," Harrison said quietly, "but I wanted to be here anyway." Something in his voice made her look at him more closely. His eyes, so often carefully neutral, held an intensity that made her breath catch. The moment stretched between them, loaded with things unsaid. "Josephine," Harrison began, then stopped. He set his cup down and stood, the blanket falling from his shoulders. "I need to tell you something, and I hope it will not make things awkward between us." "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew, could feel the truth of it hovering in the charged air. "When I hired you, it was meant to be strictly business. You needed work, I needed help. Simple as that." He ran a hand through his damp hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "But somewhere along the way, it stopped being simple. I find myself thinking about you when I am out with the cattle, wondering what you are doing, if you are happy here, looking forward to coming home in a way I never did before." Josephine's heart hammered in her chest. "Harrison." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know this is not what we agreed to. I know you came here for independence, not for some cowboy's romantic notions. If you want things to stay as they are, I will respect that. I will never mention this again, and we can go on as we have been. But I needed you to know. You deserve to know." The rain pounded against the windows, filling the silence while Josephine struggled to find words. The truth was, she had been fighting her own growing feelings for weeks, telling herself they were simply gratitude or the natural affection that came from working closely with someone. But standing here now, with Harrison looking at her like she was something precious and breakable, she could not deny what had been building between them. "I thought it was just me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was being foolish, letting myself feel—" "What do you feel?" Harrison asked, taking a step closer. "Safe," Josephine said, the word coming out raw and honest. "For the first time in so long, I feel safe and happy. And when you come home in the evenings, She swallowed hard. "I care for you, Harrison. More than I should, probably. More than I meant to." He closed the remaining distance between them, reaching out to cup her face gently in his calloused hands. "There is no should about this," he said. "If we both feel it, if we both want it, then it is right." "Is it?" Josephine asked, searching his eyes. "You are my employer. I depend on you for everything. How can this be equal?" "Then I will tear up the employment agreement," Harrison said immediately. "You can stay here as my equal, my partner, or I will help you find other work, somewhere you can be independent. Whatever you need to feel that this is your choice and yours alone." The offer was so sincere, so utterly without guile, that Josephine felt something crack open in her chest. This man who had found her desperate and hungry and given her dignity when he could have demanded anything, was willing to sacrifice his own happiness to ensure hers. How could she not love him for that? "I do not want other work," she said, bringing her own hands up to cover his. "I want to stay here, with you, if you truly want me." "I want you," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you more than I have wanted anything in my life." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as though she might break. Josephine leaned into him, letting herself feel the full weight of the connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I should do this properly," he said. "Court you, ask your permission to call on you. But we live in the same house, and we have been sharing meals for months. It seems a bit backward." Josephine laughed, the sound startling in its lightness. "Everything about our situation is backward, but I do not care about proper, Harrison. I care about honest. And this, what we have, it feels honest." "It is," he agreed. "The most honest thing I have ever known." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms while the storm raged outside. Eventually, Harrison pulled back enough to look at her seriously. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not right away, not until you are ready. But I want you to know that is where my heart is heading. I want you as my wife, my partner in all things. I want to build a life with you." "I want that, too," Josephine said, the words coming easily despite the magnitude of what they meant. "I never thought I would say that to anyone, but with you it feels right." "Then we will take our time and do it properly," Harrison said. "I will court you like a gentleman, even if we are living under the same roof. And when you are certain, when you have no doubts at all, we will make it official." True to his word, Harrison began courting Josephine in earnest, despite the unconventional circumstances. He picked wildflowers and left them on the kitchen table. He brought her ribbons from town and books he thought she might enjoy. On Sunday afternoons, when the ranch work was caught up, he would hitch the wagon and take her on long drives through the countryside, pointing out the places he loved and listening while she talked about her dreams for the future. Mrs. Fletcher visited more frequently and quickly became Josephine's confidant. When Josephine shyly mentioned that Harrison had expressed his intentions, the older woman beamed with approval. "I had hoped something like this might happen," Sarah admitted over coffee one afternoon. "You are good for each other. Anyone with eyes can see it." "It seems so fast," Josephine said, voicing the concern that sometimes nagged at her. "Just a few months ago, I was living on the street. How can I be sure this is real and not just gratitude?" "Do you love him?" Sarah asked bluntly. Josephine thought about it, really thought about it. She thought about the way her heart lifted when she saw Harrison riding in at the end of the day. The way his laugh made her feel warm and light. The way he listened when she talked, truly listened, as though her thoughts mattered. The way he had given her not just food and shelter, but dignity and choice. Yes, she said softly. I love him. Then it is real, Sarah said firmly. Love is not less valid just because it grew from hardship. Sometimes the strongest foundations are built on rock bottom. As summer gave way to fall, the relationship between Josephine and Harrison deepened into something solid and sure. They worked together on the ranch, partners in truth as well as name. Harrison taught her to ride properly, and they spent golden afternoons checking fence lines together, talking about everything and nothing. Josephine learned the cattle business, offering suggestions that Harrison took seriously, implementing changes that improved their efficiency. In October, Harrison rode into town and returned with a small velvet box. That evening, after they had finished supper and were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, he got down on one knee. Josephine Lambert, he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. You have made my house a home and my life worth living. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Josephine looked at the ring, then at Harrison's face, open and hopeful and dear. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, desperate and afraid, eating spoiled food in an alley. She thought about the woman she was now, strong and secure and loved. The transformation felt like a miracle, and this man kneeling before her had been the instrument of it. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. Yes, I will marry you. Harrison slipped the ring on her finger and stood to kiss her properly, his arms wrapping around her, as though he would never let go. When they finally parted, both were grinning like fools. Should we set a date? Josephine asked, admiring the way the ring caught the last of the light. Whenever you are ready, Harrison said, though I confess I would marry you tomorrow if you were willing. Let us wait until after the harvest is in, Josephine suggested. I want Sarah to be there, and anyone else from the community who wishes to come. Let us do it right. They were married on a bright November morning in the small church in Fort Davis. Sarah Fletcher stood as Josephine's witness, and a rancher friend of Harrison's named Thomas served as his. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by the few people who had become their community. Mrs. Chin was there, along with several other townspeople who had watched Josephine's transformation with approval. Even the hotel proprietor attended, looking slightly ashamed of his earlier judgment. Josephine wore a new dress that Sarah had helped her sew, pale blue calico with a white collar. Harrison wore his Sunday best, his hair neatly combed and his face shining with happiness. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Harrison kissed her with such tender intensity that several women in attendance sighed with romantic approval. The reception was held at Sarah Fletcher's ranch, where tables had been set up in the yard and food laid out in abundance. There was music from a fiddler and dancing on the packed earth, and Josephine found herself swept up in the celebration. She danced with Harrison, with Thomas, with Sarah's grown sons who had ridden in from their own ranches to attend. She laughed until her sides ached, and ate until she was pleasantly full, marveling at the difference a year could make. As the sun set and the celebration began to wind down, Harrison pulled her aside. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Northwood?" he asked, testing out her new name. "Ready," Josephine said, liking the sound of it more than she had expected. They rode back to the ranch under a sky blazing with stars, Harrison's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest. When they arrived, Harrison insisted on carrying her over the threshold, making her laugh as he maneuvered them through the door. "Welcome home," he said, setting her down gently in the main room. "I have been home," Josephine said, touching his face. "For months now. You made sure of that." "And I will keep making sure of it," Harrison promised. "Every day for the rest of our lives." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a natural progression of the intimacy they had been building for months. Afterward, lying in Harrison's bed with his arms around her, Josephine felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Harrison asked, concerned. "I am just happy," she said. "So happy it frightens me a little. I keep thinking I will wake up and find this was all a dream." "Not a dream," Harrison said, kissing her forehead. "A new beginning. For both of us." The first year of their marriage brought challenges as they learned to navigate their new roles as husband and wife rather than employer and employee. There were disagreements about money and work distribution, moments of frustration when Josephine felt Harrison was being overprotective, and times when Harrison felt Josephine was taking on too much. But they talked through each conflict, learning the rhythm of compromise and the strength that came from truly working as partners. In the spring, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The realization filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had never thought much about children, had been too focused on survival to imagine a future that included them. But now, carrying Harrison's child, she found herself fiercely protective of the life growing inside her. Harrison was thrilled and terrified in equal measure. He fussed over her constantly, trying to take over the household chores and insisting she rest more than she wanted. Josephine tolerated his concern with patience, understanding that it came from love, even when it bordered on smothering. Sarah Fletcher became an invaluable resource, offering practical advice and reassurance. She had raised 4 children and helped birth countless others in the community. Under her guidance, Josephine felt more confident about the process ahead. "You are strong," Sarah told her during one visit. "I have seen you survive things that would have broken other women. You will handle this just fine." The baby came in December, a month of cold winds and occasional snow. Labor was long and difficult, but Sarah was there throughout, coaching Josephine through the pain while Harrison paced the main room like a caged animal. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy boy with a strong set of lungs, Harrison burst into tears. "A son," he said wonderingly, holding the tiny bundle with exquisite care. "We have a son." They named him Henry Thomas Northwood, honoring Harrison's father and his friend who had stood with them at their wedding. Little Henry proved to be a demanding infant, keeping them both exhausted through the winter months. But watching Harrison with their son, seeing the gentle patience with which he handled diaper changes and midnight feedings, Josephine fell in love with her husband all over again. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. Harrison expanded his herd and added several new horses to train and sell. Josephine managed the household and garden while caring for Henry, somehow finding time to help Harrison with the books and business planning. They worked as a true team, each complementing the other's strengths. When Henry was 2, Josephine became pregnant again. This time she was more confident, less afraid, though the birth proved even more difficult than the first. The baby was a girl, tiny and perfect, with Josephine's green eyes and Harrison's dark hair. They named her Margaret Rose after Josephine's aunt, who had tried to give her a better life. With 2 children, the house felt full to bursting with life and love. Henry proved to be a gentle big brother, fascinated by his baby sister, and eager to help however his toddler hands could manage. Harrison built additions to the house, adding another bedroom and expanding the kitchen. What had started as a bachelor's simple dwelling became a true family home. Sarah Fletcher remained a constant presence in their lives, becoming an honorary grandmother to the children. She taught Josephine the finer points of preserving food, shared recipes passed down through her family, and provided a female friendship that Josephine treasured. When Sarah's health began to decline in her later years, Josephine and Harrison were there to support her, repaying the kindness she had shown them. The children grew, and the ranch grew with them. Henry showed an early aptitude for working with horses, spending hours at his father's side learning the trade. Margaret proved to have her mother's practical nature and her father's gentle strength, capable of both delicate needlework and hard ranch labor. On their 10th anniversary, Harrison took Josephine back to Fort Davis for dinner at the hotel where he had bought her that first meal. The proprietor, now old and gray, greeted them warmly, remembering the ragged woman and the cowboy who had insisted on feeding her. "I am glad it worked out for you two," he said, his eyes misty. "I will admit I had my doubts at the time, but I have never been happier to be proven wrong." As they ate, Josephine thought about that day 10 years ago, about the desperation and fear that had consumed her. She thought about Harrison finding her behind the mercantile, about his simple offer that had changed everything. She woke each morning not knowing if she would eat, and the cowboy made sure she never wondered again. But he had given her so much more than food and shelter. He had given her dignity, partnership, love, and a future she could never have imagined in her darkest moments. "What are you thinking about?" Harrison asked, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Everything," Josephine said, lacing her fingers through his. "How far we have come. How grateful I am." "I am the grateful one," Harrison said. "You took a lonely cowboy and his empty house and made them into a family. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "We are the best thing that happened to each other," Josephine corrected. "We saved each other in different ways." They talked late into the evening, reminiscing about their early days and dreaming about the future. When they finally drove home under a canopy of stars, Josephine felt the same contentment that had been her companion for a decade. Life was not without its challenges. There were still hard days and difficult seasons, but she faced them with Harrison at her side and their children around them, secure in the knowledge that she would never again wake wondering if she would eat, never again face the world alone. The ranch continued to prosper as the children moved into their teenage years. Henry had become a skilled horseman, his reputation spreading beyond their immediate community. At 16, he was already receiving offers to work at larger ranches, though he showed no inclination to leave. Margaret, now 14, had developed a keen business sense, helping her mother with the household accounts and suggesting improvements that increased their efficiency and profit. Harrison had mellowed with age, the hard edges worn smooth by years of domestic happiness. He still worked the ranch with the same dedication, but he made sure to balance labor with family time, often knocking off early to teach Henry a new skill or take Margaret riding through the hills she loved. He never forgot what it felt like to be alone, and he treasured every moment with his family. Josephine had blossomed into a woman of quiet confidence and strength. The frightened, desperate girl who had once scavenged for scraps was entirely gone, replaced by a rancher's wife who could manage a household, raise children, help birth a calf, and negotiate with buyers in town with equal competence. She had become a respected member of the community, someone other women turned to for advice and support. She made sure to help where she could, remembering what it felt like to have nothing and no one. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Josephine told Harrison about an encounter she had in town that morning. "I saw a young woman at the mercantile," she said, her voice thoughtful. "She looked like I did when you found me. Hungry, scared, trying to pretend she was fine. I gave her some money for food and told her about a widow in town who needs help with her laundry business. I hope she takes it." Harrison squeezed her hand. "You have a good heart, Josie." "I just remember," Josephine said simply. "I remember what it felt like, and I know how much a little kindness can matter." As the years continued to pass, Henry eventually married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, a bright young woman named Elizabeth, who fit seamlessly into the Northwood family. They built a house on the northern section of Harrison and Josephine's land, close enough to help with the ranch, but far enough to establish their independence. Within a few years, they had given Harrison and Josephine two grandsons, rambunctious boys who reminded Josephine of Henry at that age. Margaret took longer to marry, focused on helping run the ranch and caring for her aging parents. When she finally fell in love, it was with a school teacher from Fort Davis named Daniel, a gentleman who loved books and was perfectly content to move to the ranch rather than expecting Margaret to abandon her family. They married when Margaret was 25 and eventually had 3 daughters, much to everyone's delight. Sarah Fletcher passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Harrison and Josephine attended the funeral with their family, mourning the loss of a woman who had been instrumental in their happiness. Josephine thought about how Sarah had made sure she was safe, how the older woman's support had given her confidence in those early days. She vowed to be that person for other women, to extend the chain of kindness that had saved her own life. As Harrison and Josephine grew older, they gradually turned more of the ranch operations over to Henry and Margaret, though they remained active and involved. Harrison's hair went gray, then white, and his hands developed the arthritis common to men who had worked hard all their lives. Josephine's face gained lines, but her eyes remained bright and her spirit undiminished. They settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long and happy marriage, the kind of partnership that grows deeper with each passing year. On their 30th anniversary, their children and grandchildren organized a celebration at the ranch. The house and yard filled with family and friends. 3 generations gathered to honor the couple whose love story had become somewhat legendary in the community. The ragged woman and the cowboy who had given her a chance, who had built a life of such abundance from such desperate beginnings. As Josephine looked around at the assembled crowd, at her children and their spouses, at the grandchildren playing in the yard, at Harrison beside her with his hand firmly clasped in hers, she felt a swell of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. This was her life, these were her people, and it had all started with one act of kindness from a lonely cowboy who saw her worth when she could barely see it herself. 30 years, Harrison said, echoing her thoughts. Hard to believe sometimes. Best 30 years of my life, Josephine said, leaning into him. Every single day of them. Even the hard ones? Harrison asked, a smile in his voice. Especially the hard ones, Josephine said, because we faced them together. Henry stood to give a toast, raising his glass high. To my parents, he said, his voice carrying across the yard, who taught me what love looks like, what partnership means, and how to face life with courage and grace. Thank you for everything you have given us. The crowd raised their glasses in agreement, voices blending in well wishes and affection. Harrison and Josephine stood together, accepting the love of their family, the fruit of their decades of hard work and devotion. Later, after the party had wound down and the last guests had departed, Harrison and Josephine sat on the porch in the gathering dusk. The mountains were dark shapes against the violet sky, stars beginning to emerge like pinpricks of light. Do you ever think about that day? Harrison asked quietly. The day I found you behind the mercantile? Sometimes, Josephine admitted, though it feels like it happened to someone else in a different life. You were so proud, Harrison said, his voice warm with memory. So determined not to beg or accept charity. I admired that, even as I wanted to help you. I was so hungry, Josephine said, allowing herself to remember, and so scared. I did not know how much longer I could keep going. Then you appeared and offered me kindness without demands. You saved my life, Harrison, literally saved it. We saved each other, Harrison said, the same words Josephine had spoken years before. I was alive, but not really living. You gave me purpose, family, joy, everything worth having. They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the night deepen around them. Inside the house, they could hear Margaret and Daniel settling the girls for the night, the ordinary sounds of family life that had become the backdrop of their existence. From the north pasture came the lowing of cattle, from the barn the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. These were the sounds of home, of the life they had built together from nothing. I love you, Josephine said softly, more now than ever. And I love you, Harrison replied, more than words can say. As they sat there together, Josephine thought about the arc of her life, about the young woman who had once believed she would die alone and forgotten in a dusty Texas town. She thought about waking each morning, not knowing if she would eat, about the gnawing fear and the desperate measures it drove her to. And she thought about Harrison, the cowboy who had made sure she never wondered again, who had given her not just food, but a future, not just shelter, but a home, not just survival, but a life worth living. The years continued their steady march, bringing the changes that time always brings. Harrison's arthritis worsened, making it harder for him to work the ranch, though he never lost his connection to the land and the animals. Josephine developed a touch of rheumatism herself, her hands growing stiff on cold mornings. But they adapted, finding new ways to be useful, new roles to fill. Harrison mentored young ranchers in the area, sharing the wisdom of his decades of experience. Josephine became the matriarch of the family, the one everyone turned to for advice and comfort. Their golden anniversary was a quieter affair than their 30th, more intimate but no less meaningful. By then, they had 8 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, a clan that bore their stamp in features and character. Henry had proven to be an excellent steward of the ranch, expanding it carefully and running it profitably. Margaret and Daniel had started a school on the ranch property, educating not just their daughters but children from neighboring ranches, spreading knowledge and opportunity. Harrison and Josephine spent their days in gentle routine, still sharing meals and conversation, still finding joy in each other's company. On warm afternoons, they would sit on the porch, watching the life of the ranch unfold around them. Sometimes they talked, reminiscing about the past or discussing the present. Other times, they simply sat in companionable silence, needing no words to communicate what had been said and felt 1,000 times before. One spring evening, as the Texas sky blazed with sunset color, Harrison turned to Josephine with a serious expression. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "If I go first, you will be taken care of. The ranch is set up to provide for you, and the children know to look after you. You will never be alone or hungry again. I have made sure of it." "Hush," Josephine said, though tears pricked her eyes. "We are not going anywhere for a long time yet." "Maybe not," Harrison agreed. "But I needed to say it. Needed you to know that caring for you, making sure you never wondered where your next meal would come from, that has been the privilege of my life. The best thing I ever did was offer you supper that day." "The best thing I ever did was say yes," Josephine replied, taking his weathered hand in hers. "To supper, to the job, to you. Yes to all of it." They sat together as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch spread out before them, the land they had worked and loved, the home they had built together. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family visiting, of grandchildren laughing and children talking. It was the sound of legacy, of lives that would continue long after they were gone. Harrison lived to see his 80th birthday, surrounded by his ever-growing family. He remained sharp-minded until the end, still offering advice and wisdom to anyone who asked. When he finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Josephine beside him, as she had been for more than 50 years. The community mourned his loss, remembering him as a fair man, a good neighbor, and a devoted family man. Josephine grieved deeply but with grace, supported by the family she and Harrison had created. She remained at the ranch, still vital and engaged, still the center around which the family orbited. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see 2 more great-grandchildren born, long enough to know that the family's future was secure. In her final days, as she lay in the bed she had shared with Harrison, Josephine was surrounded by love. Her children held her hands, her grandchildren gathered close, and her great-grandchildren played quietly in the corner. Margaret sat beside her, gently stroking her hair. "Are you at peace, Mama?" Margaret asked softly. Josephine smiled, her mind drifting back through the decades. She saw herself as that desperate young woman behind the mercantile, hungry and afraid. She saw Harrison as he had been then, younger and earnest, offering her a chance at life. She saw their wedding day, the births of their children, the building of the ranch, the accumulation of years, and love, and family. She had woken each morning not knowing if she would eat, and the cowboy had made sure she never wondered again. But more than that, he had given her everything: love, family, purpose, and joy beyond measure. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I am at peace. I had a good life, the best life. Josephine Lambert, Northwood, passed away quietly on a spring morning, with the sun streaming through the window and her family surrounding her with love. She was buried beside Harrison on a hillside overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the words, "Together Forever." The ranch continued under Henry's stewardship, then passed to his son and then to his grandson. The house was expanded and updated over the years, but the original structure remained at its heart, a testament to the foundation Harrison and Josephine had built. Their story became family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder of how love and kindness could transform lives and build legacies that endured long after the individuals were gone. In Fort Davis, the old mercantile where Mr. Chen had once run his business was eventually replaced by a modern building, but a historical marker was placed nearby. It commemorated not just the business, but the story of a desperate woman and a compassionate cowboy whose chance meeting had blossomed into one of the town's most enduring love stories. School children learned about it in their Texas history classes, and tourists sometimes stopped to take pictures, imagining that long ago day when everything changed. But the real legacy of Harrison and Josephine Northwood was not in markers or stories, but in the descendants who carried their blood and their values forward, in the great-great-grandchildren who learned to ride horses and tend cattle on land their ancestors had worked, in the family reunions held each summer on the ranch, where dozens of people gathered to celebrate their connection to each other and to the couple who had started it all. In the acts of kindness extended to strangers, remembering how one act of compassion had created ripples that spread across generations. The land itself seemed to remember them, the mountains standing eternal witness to the love that had unfolded in their shadow. The creek still ran clear and cold. The grass still grew thick after the rains, and the house still stood strong against the Texas wind. And sometimes, when the evening light hit just right, you could almost see them there on the porch, an old cowboy and his wife, hands clasped together, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors too beautiful for words. It had all started with hunger and hope, with a woman at her lowest point and a man who saw past her circumstances to her worth. It had started with a simple offer of supper and grown into something vast and enduring. She had woken each morning not knowing if she would eat, and the cowboy had made sure she never wondered again. But in ensuring her survival, Harrison had given Josephine the space to become fully herself, to grow into the woman she was meant to be. And Josephine, in accepting his help and eventually his love, had given Harrison the family and purpose that had been missing from his life. Their story was one of transformation and redemption, of two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful from their unlikely beginning. It was a story of the Wild West, of the hardships and opportunities that defined that era, but more than that, it was a story of love in its truest form, patient and kind, enduring all things, hoping all things, never failing. And though Harrison and Josephine were long gone, their love remained, woven into the land and the family they had created, a testament to what was possible when one person reached out to another in compassion and understanding. In a harsh world, in a difficult time, they had created something soft and safe and enduring. They had created home. The generations that followed never forgot the lesson at the heart of their family story, that kindness matters, that one person's compassion can change the trajectory of another's entire life, that love built on respect and partnership is the strongest foundation of all. They remembered that survival is important, but living is what matters, and that the greatest gift you can give another person is the security to become fully themselves. And so the legacy continued, year after year, generation after generation, all of it traceable back to one summer evening in 1883 when a cowboy found a desperate woman behind a mercantile and offered her supper. Such a small gesture, such profound consequences. A reminder that we never know when our actions might change a life or how a single moment of compassion might echo through the ages, creating beauty and love and family where before there was only loneliness and hunger. In the end, that is what mattered most. Not the land or the ranch or the prosperity they had built, but the love they had shared and the family that love had created. Everything else was just details, window dressing on the simple truth that Harrison and Josephine had found each other when they both needed it most, and together they had built something worth remembering, something worth celebrating, something that would endure as long as there were people to tell their story and carry their legacy forward. She woke each morning not knowing if she would eat, and the cowboy made sure she never wondered again. It was the beginning of everything, the first line in a story that would span decades and touch countless lives. And though the story had reached its natural conclusion, with both protagonists long since passed and resting in the earth they had loved, the truth of what they had built together remained, constant and unchanging as the Texas sky, enduring as the mountains, eternal as love itself.